Last night, Patty Gilger started out with a story in introducing the keynote speaker from a 100th birthday and a celebration for Dorothy Day in 1997, and I'm going to do the same, actually, except mine was in Minneapolis, and a group of people got together to celebrate Dorothy's 100th birthday, and it mostly consisted of people telling stories, people that had known Dorothy Day telling stories. And my favorite story that was told that day was by a guy who, as a young man, was a member of the New York community in Dorothy's final years. And one day, it was Peter Maurin's birthday. He had been gone for many years, of course, but somebody baked him a cake, a birthday cake. And so this guy was delegated to go tell Dorothy up in her room. So he went up to her room and he knocked on the door and he said, would you like to come down and have a piece of birthday cake to honor Peter Maurin? And she looked at him and said, I haven't had a happy day since I met that man. I just thought that was great. I don't think Dorothy Day gets enough credit for being funny. But anyway, I thought I was going to suggest to James that would be a great motto for the conference. Anyway, I have just met Lincoln Rice, but he strikes me as a person who has had many happy days since meeting Peter Maurin and his writings. And Lincoln has done probably more than anybody else here to get Peter's writings back out into the public forum. So 2020, I think the book came out, the great big book of all of the easy essays, including some that had never been published before, and that was a massive and really important work that Lincoln has done. He is a true worker and a true scholar. He has been a member of the Casa Maria Catholic worker community in Milwaukee for over 25 years. And he has a PhD as well from Marquette in Christian ethics, and has written other interesting things, including a book on the theological ethics of child protective services, which comes out of his experience and the experience of the community there in Milwaukee that has put a great emphasis on working with women who have been through that system. And he's also written on Black liberation theology and has a really important book, as James mentioned, about Arthur Falls, who is a great figure in the Catholic worker movement and really in the kind of what's known as the longer civil rights movement. The civil rights movement doesn't begin when Rosa Parks decides not to give up her seat. There's actually all kinds of work that's going back to the 30s and beyond, and Arthur Falls is one of the key kind of figures in that movement as well. And so Lincoln has done a great service in bringing him to our attention as well. So without any further introductions, please join me in welcoming Lincoln Rice.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you. It's an honor to be here, and thanks to James and everyone, all the people who've put this together. No slideshow, but I'm going to be going through Peter's, not essay by essay, reading them one by one, but that black book you got when you got here, if you wanted to follow along, I will be hitting essays saying which month I'm in, so you kind of have a ready-made guide. And but in any case, and I wrote down my remarks just because I want to make sure I get everything. Oh, should I move it up?
A little bit closer, yeah.
Thank you. I want to make sure I get everything correct exactly as Peter had said many of these things. So Peter Maurin, the title of this talk, I'm calling it Peter Maurin, Systematic Agitator. Peter Maurin presented his essays in short, poetic phrases that have become known as easy essays. Readers of the New York Catholic Worker often see individual essays published from time to time, Perhaps his best-known essay is Better and Better Off. This essay makes a humorous turn of phrase with its play on the title. The essay begins, "The world would be better off if people tried to become better, and people would become better if they stopped trying to become better off." And the essay continues on this track. Unfortunately, I believe the isolation of certain humorous and catchy essays by Peter have further cemented the view of Peter being idiosyncratic, and his writings have often been dismissed. Luke Stocking, in his master's thesis on Peter Maurin, was the first to emphasize the importance of what he calls Maurin's arrangements. Peter rarely printed or recited a single easy essay in isolation from others. He preferred to combine several easy essays into a larger arrangement in which individual essays would reinforce and build on one another to flesh out a larger idea or argument. As Stocking notes, quote, "Referencing the easy essays by their arrangements gives an additional tool of analysis," end quote. In my presentation this morning, I'd like to accomplish the following. First, analyze Peter's arrangements during the first year of the newspaper. I'll give special attention to the arrangements from the first 2 months of the paper, which I believe are Peter Maurin's Magna Carta. These arrangements are foundational for his vision of the Catholic worker. Second, I'll note 2 additional topics of interest in Peter's writings. So, starting with the first year of the easy essays and his first 10 easy essays from the first 2 months. In this section, I'll examine each of the 10 essays listed in the first 2 issues of the paper. Then I will more broadly discuss his arrangements during the remainder of the year. The first 2 issues of the paper are foundational in laying out Peter's thought. Though Luke Stocking wrote that the essays in the first issue were randomly gathered, I believe this is one of the few instances where he is mistaken. I am positing that in the first issue of the paper, Peter states the problem, and in the second issue of the paper, he proposes a solution. Peter firmly believed that before you could offer a solution for a better future, you needed to know how we arrived at the present. The first essay in the first issue of the paper was Institutions-Corporations. Here, Maurin contrasts the problematic nature of corporations, which are, quote, "organized to promote the wealth of the classes," end quote. Institutions are founded to foster the welfare of the masses. Peter is preparing us for his Catholic Worker program, which will counteract the crippling influence of corporations. The second essay, Ethics and Economics, cites several sources to argue that the social problem is also an economic and ethical problem. Maurin is clearly voicing his disagreement with Adam Smith's notion of the invisible hand, which argues that a capitalist economy will self-correct itself despite individuals being only concerned for their own well-being. Peter concludes this essay by stating that the ethics of canon law, or church law, as embodied in the encyclicals of Pius XI and Leo XIII, can address the lack of ethics in economics. The social encyclicals of both these popes asserted the necessity of morality in forming an economic system. Peter's third essay is a popular one, Blowing the Dynamite. In the previous essay, he offered what would come to be known as Catholic social teaching as a moral response. In this essay, he complains that this message is not being proclaimed. He takes special aim at Catholic scholars who, quote, "have wrapped it up in nice phraseology, placed it in a hermetic container, and sat on the lid," end quote. For the moral message of the church to take center stage, we need to blow the dynamite of the message. This is exactly what Peter is trying to do. In his fourth essay, The Moneylender's Dole, Peter observes that the poor are receiving negligible government aid while the banks receive more than $1 billion. So back then the banks didn't get as much as they do now. But echoing the prophets of Israel and the fathers of the church, Peter reminds his readers that lending money at interest was forbidden. The traditional prohibition against interest in the Old Testament and in the teachings of the Catholic Church was meant to prevent the exploitation of the poor. Peter adds to this tradition. In a capitalist economy, constant and unnecessary growth depend on the borrowing of money from financial institutions. And when those institutions become too big to fail, Maurin observes that they become, quote, the first citizens on Uncle Sam's payroll, end quote. The final 3 essays of this issue expand on the previous essay about the harm caused by lending money at interest. In his 5th essay, Mortgaged, he explains the harm caused to homeowners, farmers, and local governments because they have mortgaged their property. In the 6th essay, Out of the Temple, Peter laments that even though, quote, Christ drove the moneylenders out of the temple, end quote, they are now given prestige because churches are now financed by bank loans. In his last essay for the May issue, Wealth-Producing Maniacs, he observes how the unnecessary growth of the Roaring Twenties was only possible because of quote, a worldwide orgy of wealth and life destruction. Millions of people find themselves victims in a worldwide depression brought about by a world gone mad on mass production and mass distribution, end quote. In one sense, this first collection of Peter Maurin's easy essays is pessimistic. It began with a glimmer of hope about the ethics of the Catholic tradition, but then finished with a worldwide depression. Maurin saved the good news for the second issue of the paper. I believe Peter originally intended to have the 3 essays in the second issue of the paper conclude his arrangement in the May 1933 issue, but limited space for his essays probably prevented this. And as many of you I'm sure know, the first issue of the paper is brought up last night. When he first saw it, he thought it'd be just mainly his essays, so it makes sense he would have had more space. And when he saw all of the other things in the paper he disagreed with, he was very unhappy. In any case, the 3 essays featured in the second issue comprise Maurin's 3-point program that he would come to call the Green Revolution, owing to its Irish roots. The first essay, Roundtable Discussions, describes a staple event in many Catholic worker communities where people learn about and discuss the problems of the day and, quote, how a path can be made from things as they are to things as they should be, end quote. The second essay describes his concept for Houses of Hospitality, which is also the title of it, which, quote, give the rich the opportunity to serve the poor, end quote. Remembering Peter's first essay contrasting corporations and institutions, he posits that these houses, quote, bring back institutions to the technique of institutions, end quote. In his last essay, Agronomic Universities, he proposes the farming commune as another institution where the unemployed will have access to free rent, free fuel, free food, skill acquisition, mind improvement, and spiritual guidance. Now moving on to the rest of the year. In the third issue of the paper, June 1933, contains an arrangement of easy essays that further explore the economic problem of capitalism. Peter begins his essays observing that the selfishness of businessmen creates problems, and that the mastering of subjects by college professors is not helping anyone to, quote, master situations, end quote. Maurin continues his arrangement with a harsh critique of liberals who are, quote, not fanatics about anything, end quote, even though it will take fanatics to correct our current problems. Maurin is critical of religious, philosophical, and economic liberalism. Religious liberalism, and just to be clear, here liberalism is referring more to these very specific philosophical, religious, and economic forms. It's not like liberal as in you're a Democrat as opposed to a Republican. Religious liberalism privatizes the role of religion and does not believe it should hold any authority in the public forum. Philosophical liberalism stresses the authority of the individual over outside sources, be they religious or governmental. Economic liberalism promotes laissez-faire capitalism with limited oversight. Maurin concludes the arrangement by pointing out that both capital and labor view the labor of workers as a commodity and not as a gift. In this sense, the labor movement, though it is trying to obtain a living wage for workers in the short term, is not working to change a system based on liberalism and greed. In his response to a letter in the February 1934 issue of the paper, Maurin promotes a theory of labor that incorporates self-expression. In later essays, Maurin will repudiate industrialism and the assembly line because they lack the opportunity for self-expression and creativity. In September 1933, Maurin published one arrangement of essays that more properly seems like two. The first two essays in the issue confront the false belief that people can serve two masters, God and money. Even though some people may delude themselves into believing that this can be done, it will always lead to the bank account becoming, quote, the standard of values, end quote. The remaining four essays explore Peter's vision of the state. He begins by emphasizing the need for each person to organize oneself. Appealing to Thomas Jefferson, Peter promotes the idea that government is not meant to solve economic problems. To further this argument, his next essay observes that, quote, a politician is an artist in the art of keeping up with public opinion. Such a person is not fit to lead and should not be expected to lead. Peter concludes his arrangement by lamenting the separation of religion not only from the state, but also from education, politics, and business. As Maurin eloquently concludes, quote, when religion has nothing to do with education, education is only information. When religion has nothing to do with politics, politics is only factionalism. When religion has nothing to do with business, business is only commercialism. And when religion has nothing to do with education, politics, or business, people have little to do with religion. End quote. For Peter, the reason that religion can improve the ends of education, politics, and business is because religion has a functional vision for society. Liberalism, with its emphasis on laissez-faire capitalism, does not have ethics. Even worse, it promotes selfishness. In early October 1933, the National Conference of Catholic Charities, the forerunner to Catholic Charities, was meeting in New York and would be attended by several bishops. In anticipation, Maurin published an arrangement of essays in the October issue called, quote, to the bishops of the U.S., a plea for houses of hospitality, end quote. This arrangement consisted of 7 essays. The first, Duty of Hospitality, berates the lack of hospitality in Christian countries and elevates people in need to the status of ambassadors of God, who, quote, should be given food, clothing, and shelter by those who are able to give it, end quote. The second essay, Municipal Lodge, laments that guest rooms in the homes of the rich are not reserved for these ambassadors, who are instead treated inhospitably at the city's municipal lodge. The next 3 essays relate the history of houses of hospitality, which Maurin notes an early North African church council prescribes bishops to have connected to their churches. The 2 final essays urge the reintroduction of houses of hospitality by the local parish. At this point, it should be remembered that Dorothy Day did not start the first Catholic worker house of hospitality until 2 months later in December of 1933. In October, 2 months earlier, Maurin was still hoping that these houses would be instituted by the bishops. The final essay in the October arrangement notes that this proposed hospitality would be a form of Catholic action. Catholic action did not simply refer to actions performed by Catholics, but included the notion that these actions were performed by the laity at the direction of bishops and priests. This is why in his earlier essay, Houses of Hospitality, which was reprinted in the October arrangement, it includes the line, quote, "We need houses of hospitality to bring the bishops to the people and the people to the bishops," end quote. There are 2 additional easy essays in the October issue. There are 2 easy essay arrangements in the October issue. The second is an essay by Peter called "The Spirit of the Mass, the Spirit of the Masses." It begins by quoting a 13th century text about the Mass and concludes with Maurin's commentary on the Mass as an, quote, "unbloody repetition of the sacrifice of the cross," end quote. Peter continues by stating that Christ's entire life was one of sacrifice and that the Christian life should also be one of sacrifice. He concludes, quote, "We cannot imitate the sacrifice of Christ on Calvary by trying to get all we can. We can only imitate the sacrifice of Christ on Calvary by trying to give all we can," end quote. We see Peter aligning himself with liturgical movements of the time that argued that the Mass had repercussions for how Christians should participate in the world. We also see Maurin's first allusion in writing to voluntary poverty. He had been at this point living in voluntary poverty for several years, but it had not become an explicit part of his program in the paper. We'll come back to this. The third arrangement in the October issue, an open letter to Father Lord, M.A.G., Master Agitator. Daniel Lord was a Jesuit, and Maurin admired Father Lord's agitation among students at St. Louis University. Maurin also saw himself as an agitator, so to call Father Lord a master agitator was a great compliment. The main thrust of Peter's letter was his desire for Lord to found a school of Catholic action. With lower than hoped for attendance at Peter's clarification of thoughts in New York City up until this point, perhaps Peter believed Lord could be a catalyst for promoting dynamic Catholic thought on a larger scale. Peter would write another open letter to Father Lord in December in which he decried the rise of fascist and Bolshevik dictatorships. Maurin believed much of this was owed to modernism and liberalism, which separated the spiritual from the temporal. Instead of looking to politicians and big businesses for answers to political and economic problems, lay people should be looking to the bishops for leadership. Maurin calls on Lord to work on this issue. In November, Peter contrasts Marxism with Catholic action. Maurin critiqued traditional Marxism for its materialism and the belief that communism would naturally replace capitalism. In contrast, Peter promoted the common good as formulated by popes and bishops. He also promoted his Green Revolution as a program for a new society, the basis of which he now explicitly states is charity and voluntary poverty. In a public announcement that Peter wrote for the December 1933 issue, he for the first time uses the terms cult, culture, cultivation. which he equates respectively with liturgy, literature, and agriculture. He liked this line of thought and continued it the next month in his essay, Building Churches. In that essay, he shared how Henry Adams could not receive a proper education in the US or Europe, quote, because education implies unity of thought, and there is not unity of thought in America or Europe, end quote. But in looking at Our Lady of Chartres Cathedral, Adams discovered there was unity of thought in the 13th century. Maurin agreed with Adams and believed that the very act of building such a cathedral was a combination of cult, culture, and cultivation. That is to say, the building of the church grew out of the people's liturgy, philosophy, and labor. Whether unity of thought really existed in the Middle Ages is another question. But Peter believed that that society's grounding in liturgy created unity of thought. In the first issue of the paper, Maurin took aim at Catholic scholars for concealing the moral message of the church. In February of 1934, Peter concluded an essay arrangement with one of his most quoted phrases, quote, "The scholars must become workers so that the workers may be scholars," end quote. Maurin believed that scholars can have something meaningful to say if they participate in the world. This collaboration with the worker can provide an opportunity for both scholars and workers to create a path forward. In April 1934, Peter began the practice of naming his arrangements in the newspaper with a more specific title than Easy Essays. This final arrangement to conclude the first year of Easy Essays is called The Case for Utopia. After the first essay on how, quote, people would be better if they stopped trying to become better off, end quote, his second essay proclaims that, quote, Christianity has nothing to do with modern capitalism or modern communism, end quote. In this essay, he goes on to state that property with responsibility and voluntary poverty are Christian ideals that are rejected by modern capitalism and modern communism, respectively. To emphasize the importance of voluntary poverty, Maurin's third essay, Christ's Message, features 3 gospel quotes, with the last one emphasizing voluntary poverty. The fourth essay, What St. Francis Desired, further explores the theme of voluntary poverty by highlighting Francis's desire that people, quote, should give up superfluous possessions and offer their services as a gift, end quote. The fifth essay quotes popes in recent times who extolled the importance of the Third Order of St. Francis, which is composed of lay people. This is perhaps an attempt by Maurin to attract the Third Order to his Catholic Worker program. Before finding Dorothy, Peter had proposed his program to the directors of the Third Order without success. So, additional topics. Peter's thought evolved and grew during the remainder of his writing career, but I believe the core of his thought can be found during the first year. Nevertheless, I'd like to briefly touch on 2 topics that Peter did not explicitly write on during his first year: personalism and racism. I could have chosen to look at Peter's vision of history, his understanding of freedom, his changing view of Catholic action, his critique of clerics, or his interest in evangelization, among others, but time is limited. Personalism. It might seem surprising that Peter did not mention personalism during the first year of the Catholic Worker. The reason for this will become obvious in a few moments. The French philosopher Emmanuel Mounier is credited with first articulating and promoting personalism, first in his journal Esprit, and later in books such as the Personalist Manifesto in 1936. Esprit was first published in October 1932, 7 months before the publication of the Catholic Worker. But we do not know exactly when Peter first had the opportunity to read that journal. Since Peter first uses the term gentle personalism in July 1934, it is probable that he first came across Mounier's use of the term in Esprit shortly before that. As a side note, you can often see if there's a new book that came out and Peter read it, it often gets incorporated into his easy essays. So he's always up, refining his thought and adding new ideas that he finds helpful. Mounier described personalism as, quote, any doctrine, any civilization which affirms the primacy of the human person over the material needs and over the collective mechanisms which sustain one's development, end quote. Peter would have agreed with this. Peter's vision for a society already included much that was present in Mounier's personalism, so it was easy for Peter to incorporate it. Peter's strand of personalism emphasized personal responsibility and sacrifice, gentle personalism, and a communitarian vision. Racism. 1 year after the founding of the movement in May 1934, Maurin, along with a Protestant friend, Herman Hergenhan, moved into a Harlem storefront that had been offered for use to the Catholic worker. The main purpose of the storefront was evangelization and was not a center for confronting or organizing against racism. So time doesn't allow me to get into this, but it would be interesting at some point to dive more into Peter's attempts for evangelization. It's definitely something that drives him throughout his time at the worker. The first essays that Peter dedicated to racism appeared in the May 1938 issue of the paper when he wrote against anti-Semitism and anti-black racism. This was 5 years after the first issue of the paper was published. Maurin believed that if African Americans behaved in the loving way white people should behave, whites would be inspired to change their behavior based on, quote, the power of example. Compared to many of the black writers and activists of the 1930s, Maurin's writings on racism were tepid. In other words, on the few occasions when Peter wrote on racism, most of which focused on anti-Semitism, it seemed almost extrinsic to his broader framework. By stating that solutions to racism were extrinsic to Peter's main program, can also help us to clarify that the pernicious nature of racism must be addressed on its own merits, especially since racism is employed to justify social inequality. Conclusion, I hope this very brief dive into Peter's first year of Easy Essays has illustrated that from the beginning, Peter had a systematic plan on how to respond to the current economic, social, and moral problems that plague our society, and that more insight into Peter's essays can be garnered when his arrangements are read as a whole. Thank you.